Please note, during the time period we will be talking about today, Russia used a different calendar than the rest of the world. Unless otherwise specified, assume all dates are relative to the Russian calendar. The Russian Revolution occurred in 1917 and is often divided into two separate revolutions, the February Revolution and the October Revolution. But before we get to that, we need to go over another revolution that happened over a decade earlier, the Revolution of 1905. For years, many social groups had shown their discontent with the political and social system in Russia, and this was only heightened after Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, a story for another time. The Revolution of 1905, or at least the violent part of it, started on the Russian day of January 9th, a day known as Bloody Sunday, not to be confused with the Northern Irish Bloody Sunday of 1972. Priest Georgy Gapon, along with many St. Petersburg workers, marched to the Winter Palace to deliver a loyal petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas was not at the palace at the time, and they were met with armed guards who opened fire and killed about 130 of the peaceful protesters. As news of the massacre spread, many other groups of people were outraged. This resulted in a mass of strikes, demonstrations, insurrections, and mutinies in the military. Workers began to create a new type of institution, the Soviets. A Soviet consisted of elected delegates from workshops or factories within the town that the Soviet was in. They negotiated with the police and the employers, organized strike movements, and occasionally would do upkeep on basic municipal services. The height of the revolution was in October 1905, when St. Petersburg had a general strike declared and its own Soviet was set up. Soon the Tsar was convinced to set up an elected legislative body known as the Duma. However, the unrest across the empire did not end here. The Black Hundreds, violent monarchist groups, emerged and led attacks on Jewish people and left-wing activists. In December, the Moscow Soviet launched an armed insurrection which was stopped using artillery force, causing many lives to be lost. The unrest continued through 1907, but did not result in the change of power that the revolutions of February and October 1917 would. By 1917, the public support for the Tsar had been pretty much drained. In the Russian month of February 1917, workers in Petrograd... Petrograd was formerly St. Petersburg, but it was changed because it sounded too German. It would later become Leningrad, and now it is St. Petersburg again. Okay, so workers in Petrograd began to hold many strikes and protests. On the 22nd of that month, the largest industrial plant in Petrograd was closed due to a strike. On the 23rd, it was International Women's Day, and multiple protests were staged in Petrograd against the effects of the horribly mismanaged Russian war effort. The army had suffered major losses and seemed to be on the retreat all too often. Food was scarce, millions were dying. The women workers went to factories nearby and brought out almost 50,000 workers on strike. These protests sparked a wave of more protests and strikes that flowed across the Russian Empire. Eventually, Tsar Nicholas II was persuaded to step down. He named his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, to be his successor, but the Grand Duke knew he would have little support as ruler and declined the crown. This brought over 3 centuries of the Romanov dynasty's rule to an end. The Duma, the legislative group that had been set up in 1905, declared a provisional government. There was disorder across the nation, but the councils that the soldiers and workers had used back in 1905, the Soviets, began to resurface and gain a large voice in the ruling of Russia, and soon proved that they were more powerful than the provisional government. As the provisional government and the Soviets fought over control of the country, Russia became a more violent place, not to mention they were still fighting in the World War I, so everything together made the nation's losses far too great. The provisional government wished for the continuation of Russian involvement in the war, and on Russian March 1st, the Soviet issued Order Number 1, which commanded the military to only take orders from them and not the provisional government. The provisional government could do little about this. The provisional government had to be reorganized 4 times between March and October. The first was made up of all liberal ministers plus 1 socialist revolutionary. The following governments were all much more mixed in terms of the parties involved. None of these governments, however, were able to fix the major problems conflicting Russia. Meanwhile, in the Soviets, which were in much closer touch with the people than the provisional governments, more and more people favored Russian withdrawal from the Great War on pretty much any terms. This was particularly because the Soviet movement had become increasingly controlled by radical socialists. In April, a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin was returned to Russia from his exile in Switzerland. He took charge of the Bolsheviks and began to present speeches and declarations He denounced the continuation of war, and he, along with Leon Trotsky, began to bring the Bolsheviks to the forefront of Russian events. The Bolsheviks would call out for an end to democratic politics. Lenin thought that violence was the only thing that could pummel the rising of a democratic Russia and bring about a new Bolshevik society. By the fall of 1917, Lenin found that it was time to overthrow the provisional government and the policies created by the weird mix of people who presented themselves as everything from monarchists to socialists to liberals to anarchists. He thought the revolution would need to be violent because it would be impossible to make negotiations with such a wide variety of people. By Russian October, the Bolsheviks held the majority in both the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets. They staged a coup at a Soviet meeting and, using hostile force, took control of numerous government buildings, networks of transportation, and other forms of infrastructure. They then endorsed an election for a new assembly, but when the Bolsheviks only won a minority, they forced its dismissal before it could be instated as a government. Advocates for democracy or freedom were imprisoned and killed by the thousands. The Bolsheviks nationalized banks and industry. Towards the end of the year, they began seeking withdrawal from World War I. All that was offered by the Germans was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Russians would have to give up their western territory. Lenin originally considered the offer ridiculous, but as the threat of the Central Powers grew nearer, the treaty was eventually accepted. The revolution was now over, the Russians were out of the Great War, and the Bolsheviks were in power, but a civil war very quickly emerged. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.